Thank you so much, Wendy, and welcome to another exciting Firebytes session. Thank you so much. I've received quite a few emails in the, over the last month or so, giving me ideas on what to do for future topics. So absolutely keep those ideas coming. Again, we want to just make your time the most valuable and give you those tips and tricks as a network engineer that you need to be able to secure your environment, as well as make the most out of your WatchGuard infrastructure. So today we're going to be talking about integrating Active Directory. Now, as we talk about this, interestingly enough, it comes up as a fairly often question as I'm going through talking about the power of dimension, and all of a sudden users start seeing, or network engineers start seeing, the power of the SSO integration when they see the usernames versus just IP addresses. As you're well aware, a lot of times your IP address changes, and it's not easy to necessarily correlate an IP address to a username. I came out of an infrastructure where we had about 3,000 IP addresses, so you can imagine memorizing all of that would have been a very difficult and impossible task to find out which IP address belonged or correlated to what user. So as we talk today about a background of the agenda for today is the background on Active Directory or AD integration. We're going to talk about some of the uses that you can use of that Active Directory integration. We're going to go into using it for SSL, using it for policies, using it for the administration management. We're going to look at an overview of the integration, and then most of you that have been on before know I like to throw the slides out and go into a hands-on environment and show you a real-time how that impacts your environment and how to set that up. We're going to go over some basic troubleshooting tips for Active Directory integration, and then we're going to look at configuring a VPN setup as well as the administration or the admin users tying into Active Directory. So just a little bit of background on Active Directory integration. Just to clarify, Active Directory and SSO single sign-on complement each other. So when they're, I'm getting their questions from people looking at dimension reports and saying, how can I create or have that correlate to usernames? That's actually the single sign-on component for that. And a single sign-on is the seamless identification of users as they log on to computers. And again, if you haven't been aware of the agenda, we're going to be covering the SSO component next month. Just to recap, SSO assigns users to those IP addresses for policies and reports. So then once we have the users identified, we can now look at the Active Directory integration. So without Active Directory integration, it's really only helpful for those dimension reports. Once we do have the Active Directory configuration, we can start building policies. Now, as you see here, typically with WatchGuard, you have your IP address, as you can see on the screen. We don't have a user assigned to it. Now, with a single sign-on, we automatically assign, or we see that administrator, and there's a number of ways, we'll get into that next month, how we can get this user identification correlated to an IP address. So with the Active Directory integration, it allows you to create policies based on Active Directory users and groups. Now, we do support other databases as well. However, I've seen from a myriad of different organizations, the Active Directory is one of the more popular ways. It allows you to authenticate users to the VPN and the authentication portal. It allows you to have network admins log into the firewall dimension with Active Directory credentials. So those are just some of the ways that we can have that tie-in as well. And as you can see here with this policy, I still see a lot of organizations building policy based on any trusted or any IP address or a specific IP address range, rather than moving into a way where we can tie directly into their Active Directory group. And as we can see here, we've taken it away from any trusted, and in this sample, we're moving into, for for instance, a bank environment where maybe the managers have one set of policies and then the bank tellers have another set. So in this case, we're building policy based on the Active Directory managers group, and then if Sally belongs in the managers group, she's going to get that policy as well. So some of the benefits of the Active Directory policy integration, obviously one of the more common ones is different groups can have different policies. So as we look at that bank environment, bank managers can get to Facebook while limiting YouTube to 2 megabits per second, or we might want to give another policy to bank tellers where they can't get to Facebook, they can't do social media, we want them extremely secured down, and they can't stream YouTube. So in any environment where you have multiple tiers of policy, Active Directory integration is hands down the way to go, because if you base it on, for instance, an IP address, and all of a sudden that IP address changes because of DHCP or whatnot, all of a sudden you have more of a Swiss cheese model of security where you have all kinds of holes in your firewall. Now, as you look at some of the other ways, other uses of Active Directory integration, as I mentioned before, it allows you to authenticate users to VPN, so whether or not they're doing IPsec or SSL. And oftentimes I get a question, what can WatchGuard terminate a VPN to? And so if you're wondering about that, basically anything that a Cisco VPN can terminate a session with, WatchGuard can do the same. So it allows you to authenticate users, going back to Active Directory integration, the authentication portal. Allows you to have network admins log into the firewalls, and it allows you, again, to create policies based on Active Directory users or groups. Now, some of the more interesting, I broke that out for you because a lot of times we're so focused on our internal traffic outbound, and certainly that's a great use of using those policies for Active Directory users and groups. But I've also seen instances where maybe you want to have a remote administration of your firewalls, but you don't want to just open it up to the world for a good cause. Now, what you can actually do is, using port 4100, as you see there, you can authenticate externally and then have those policies built for that. So in essence, not that I would recommend it, but for those of you that are running, for instance, RDP over 3389 open to the world, so for starters, that's a very bad idea because it's all plain text and there's all kinds of vulnerabilities for that. But in the event that you needed to have some sort of quote-unquote poor man's solution for that, you could actually say, you know what, let's have our users authenticate to port 4100 first, and then we're going to open up 3389 to them afterwards, and we'll go over that as well. So while a lot of this is focused on internal traffic, having policies for internal traffic going outbound, we can also create those policies coming in as well into your environment. Now, as we look at the overview of Active Directory integration, so obviously you must have a Windows server with Active Directory services installed. And then you must specify an Active Directory authentication server. And then you need to, and I have the locations for that, and feel free as you're looking at this, or maybe you come across this presentation at a later date, if you want these slides, absolutely, I'll send them right over to you, as well as we'll just post it on YouTube. So to specify an Active Directory authentication server, you just go into Setup, Authentication, Authentication Servers, and all of this will start to make sense as we throw out the slides and move into a live environment. And then we want to add a user or group to the authorized users and groups list. Now, what I do recommend from that is that it is case sensitive and must be matched 100%. So case sensitive, space sensitive, what have you. What I like to do, and I'll show you in a few seconds, is just go into ADSI edit, grab that, or actually users and groups, grab that full name and then just copy and paste it out of there and into your WatchGuard firewall. So with that, let's go ahead and move into a hands-on setup, see how this is set up in real time, and we'll go from there. So as many of you realize, I love my virtual environment. This is my, let me get my slide deck out of the way. I'm running ESX. I have my environment here, actually running the latest Dimension 2 beta. If you haven't seen it, definitely hold on to your pants because it's going to be a great new product. You're going to be blown away by the power of that. But within there, I have my virtual firewall and then my Windows server as well. So as we look at that, your Windows server, I'm going to just show you here. So this is actually running the latest code on this. Let's take a look at this real quick. This is running 11.10.1 as a beta on here. But looking at your policy manager and going into that, so this is my, I apologize, let me slow down here for a second. This is my Windows server that I'm running here. I have my Active Directory, which is WatchGuard-lab.com. I have my built-in users. It's pretty vanilla at this point, everything that I've done in my environment. Now the first step I want to do is go ahead and tie my firewall into the Active Directory integration component of that. Now, as I did mention, it is, and let me repeat that, it is relatively vanilla at this point. So we just go under Setup Authentication, and we have Authentication Servers. We also have a number of other components that we can do from here. We have Authorized Users and Groups. That's where we set up the groups for that, and we'll cover that. Web Server Certificate. So this covers if you did want to be able to authenticate externally. Let's say you're at home and you wanted to be able to manage your WatchGuard firewall, rather than just have that ports available to the World Wide Web. What we can do is just open up the authentication portal 4100, then you would be able to authenticate on there. Now, if you're from home, one of the things that I would recommend is getting a web server certificate so you're not getting those server certificate errors. Now, if you're like any other IT department I've seen, you put in a server that has a temporary certificate, and then as a testing environment, all of a sudden your beta now becomes into production. And I would really caution you against training those users to be able to click on, if they have certificate errors, to be able to click on trust or continue, because in essence, those security precautions are there for their own protection. And if we're bringing on testing environments, and now we're training our users to click on, now we're also training them if they were to come into a situation where a website was hacked and it was an invalid certificate, and they click on continue, their username and password could be compromised. So you can upload a web server certificate through here, but for this sake, we're going to go into Authentication Servers component. So from here, we can actually, this is, when we talk about Firebox, this is the internal database on the firewall. So in the instance that we didn't want to do Active Directory integration, we just wanted to have a few users be able to authenticate, we can certainly do that simply by adding in users with a password here. We can give them groups as well internally. We have timeout limits as well for them. We have Radius, Secure ID, LDAP, and then Active Directory as well. So in this case, we want to just go ahead and, let's say we were doing a new domain and we wanted to tie into, for instance, our domain controller of, let's say, WatchGuard.com. Simply add in the domain name. We can add in IP addresses. And obviously, if you are a larger organization where you have multiple domain controllers, you can put those, tie those into the ports as well. Now, right off the bat, this does default to unsecure LDAP. You can enable LDAP-S simply by clicking on here. Just make sure that you're domain controller set up for that. But in this case, I want to go ahead and review what I have specified for WatchGuard-lab.com. This is our search page. So one of the easiest ways, if you've worked with Active Directory, you know this sort of setup here. One of the easiest ways to be able to get that, let me just close out and show you how to get in there, is through a little program called ADSI Edit. So we can simply get there by going Start, and then we simply type in ADSI Edit. We're going to connect to, let's go ahead and connect to my domain controller. If you had multiple domain controllers, you could connect to those as well. But in this case, we want to look for those. So now we're specifying the search base. In my setup, I just said anyone in my organization should be able to authenticate against my firewall. So I can simply grab that from here, or I could actually go into Properties, go into the distinguished name, and just copy and paste this into your organization or into your Active Directory setup on your WatchGuard. I've seen so many cases where people just do a typo or have extra space in there. To just copy and paste eliminates that method for or any chance of error on that. And then we're
Excuse me, Johan.
Yes.
Excuse me, just one moment. We have a couple of questions. Is it possible to maximize your screen? Some folks are having trouble reading it.
On this one, it is not.
Okay.
Well, because sorry, let me change my, let me see. And I apologize. That's one of the problems of having a virtual environment. And thank you, Wendy, for bringing that up. Let me just go ahead and do this real quick here. Let's see if I can maximize that out a little bit. So screen resolution. Let me just drop that down. We'll do 1280 by 720, see if it can take that. All right, let's see if this is better. Again, my apologies for that. And now it appears. One second here. And now I've lost my window. Let's go into, try that again. Now I don't have scroll on here. Okay. Well, hopefully you can see that. I'll try to get by without scroll. I've taken that off the side. And again, my apologies, but hopefully this is easier for you to see. We have our search base here. Yes?
Sorry, it's now just a blue screen.
Okay. How about that?
There we go. Oh, that is much better, and it's much bigger. Thank you.
Yeah. So hopefully I don't need scroll because I'm going to have a tough time scrolling on that. But from here we can actually see if I go in. Unfortunately, because I'm on my second screen, I go into full screen, and it doesn't want to cooperate. So we're just going to make do with this. Again, this is from ADSI Edit. Let me just show you how we get there. I just go to Start, ADSI Edit. And thank you for letting me know that, Wendy. So here we have our organization, our domain. If I had multiple domains, I could connect to them here. But again, we're just grabbing that search base where, in essence, if I wanted to lock it down to anything under users and below, then I could just grab that under here. We have our distinguished name. We could just grab that here, copy, and paste that into here. But I just want to go ahead, for the purposes of this demonstration, just authenticate everyone in my WatchGuard-lab.com domain and underneath that. We also have a group string as well, the end of searching user, password of searching user. We don't need that for most cases. And then the login attribute, again, the defaults are going to be just great for this. But we want to just go ahead and set up the IP address. And again, anytime that you can secure your organization by enabling LDAP-S. I would encourage you to do that simply for a security standpoint. So in this case, we have the authentication servers, the WatchGuard Lab. If I want to set up additional ones, I could do that as well. So let's just say I want to set up a personal email or a personal organization. I could simply do that by adding multiple domains here. And let's just go ahead and let me go ahead and type in this, and I'll show you the power of being able to have multiple domains in here. So in that case, we have WatchGuard-Lab, and then we have a bloomhart.com domain. Go ahead and click OK. Now the next step from that is to start. We have the Active Directory component tied in, but we haven't really leveraged it because we don't have any users and groups tied in from Active Directory over to that. So the next step is we want to go ahead and grab some users. Now you can create, for instance, if you wanted to create a new container or a new, let's just say in this case, we wanted to make a new group. We want to call it WatchGuard SSL VPN users. We want to make it a security group, global, that's fine. And now from here, I can go ahead and add in users on the fly that I want to be able to VPN in. So rather than go and touch my firewall every time someone gets hired or fired, I can simply, chances are you're probably doing work in Active Directory anyway, or maybe creating a template for them. So now we can simply add in users that we want to be able to authenticate into. Anyone in this group is going to be added into the firewall. So now what we can do is we want to go ahead and grab this group. So again, I just hit F2. That allows me to select the name, again, that's going to take out any chance of spelling or typos or case sensitivity. And now I can go into my firewall, set up authentication, authorize users and groups, and now I can add in that group. Now, one of the best use cases as well for having multiple scenarios is that we can specify either one domain controller, or we can specify another, or we could say if any domain controller has this group, we're going to be able to authenticate a user. So again, great way for organizations to have multiple domains in it that you don't want to necessarily manage all these instances. We can just say any authentication server that has this group, we're going to be able to create policy for it. Now, if we wanted to, we could actually take it one step further from a security standpoint and say, you know what, let's go ahead and enable login limits for each user or group. So certainly when we talk about more secure environments that are running credit cards or financial data, we can go ahead and limit those logins limits for each user, allow unlimited concurrent firewall authentication logins from the same account, or we could say let's limit it to one, and then we're going to reject subsequent login, or we're going to allow subsequent logins and log off the first session. So depending on your environment, you might find that to be useful for you. So now I've created authorized users and groups. I want to go ahead and create one more for the sample of this demonstration. Let's just say we want to make a new group called bank tellers. So I'm just going to create a bank tellers group and then create a new group as well called bank managers. So if we come under here, we have bank managers. So two additional groups. Now this is for the purpose of creating different policies depending on your group. So from here, we're going to go ahead and, again, just copy and paste each one of those out, set up authentication, authorize users and groups. We're going to add in that group. Now, if I wanted to, a great way as well is if you wanted to tie in individual users, on there you could just click on this and it's going to tie individual users. But I'm going to create a group for bank tellers and bank managers. Now we have two of those groups on the firewall. And now we can take it again from that default policy of any trusted, and I haven't done much on this policy, as you can see here. So if you have critiques or criticisms, again, this is a pretty vanilla firewall policy set. So from here, we're going to create, and what I would recommend is creating a different name for your different group. Now, depending on what you would like to call it, that's up to you. But I would encourage you to have a consistent naming scheme in your environment. Now, rather than from any trusted, as I mentioned, we can go in and click on Add. Now, if you haven't checked out the new, what we call it FQDN, or fully qualified domain names, we can now add that in as, for instance, star.microsoft. So we can build policy and allow anything, for instance, go into Office 365 and create a specific policy for that. That was just out. I'm very excited. A lot of you have been asking for that. So we just delivered, again, fully qualified domain names. In this case, going back on task, we can now look at authorized users and groups. As I mentioned, we have our firewall group, users and groups, and we can go ahead and specify, for instance, bank managers for this policy. Now, what I would really recommend, a lot of people ask, how do you build policy, or how would you suggest building policy for all of your organizations? And again, coming out of a educational environment, I would really encourage every one of you to look at your most restrictive group, build that policy, and then simply copy or create duplicates of that policy, and then simply let up your restrictions from there. So whether or not some organizations might be concerned with users surfing adult material. In my educational environment, my most restricted group was my kindergartners, and then my mobile devices. So obviously in those environments, I locked them down to all sorts of websites. I did app control, blocking them to, for instance, peer-to-peer or remote access paths. Fortunately, we didn't have too many kindergartners trying to hack the firewall. But so again, build the policies based on your most restrictive group. So in this case, I would suggest starting out with bank tellers, creating application control from there, and say, you know what, we don't want them to be able to get to, maybe it's games. And again, from here, I would really recommend that you go into select by category. You say, you know what, they shouldn't be allowed to get to bypass proxies. And again, if you haven't checked out the code on this, the latest firmware version, we now allow you, rather than just drop or allow, to simply say, you know what, you get 2 megabits per second or 10% of the available bandwidth, simply because streaming media is such a bandwidth hog out there, and we recognize the power of having streaming media in an organization, but we don't want it to overrun your, or in your case, you probably don't want it to overrun your business critical application. And you can simply allow that by your traffic management. And again, I covered that under a different series. You can view that on our YouTube channel. But in this case, we want to go ahead, again, select by category. I want to allow or deny based on my bank managers. I can then go into my web blocker and say, let's create a new policy for that. Create a policy for my bank tellers. And again, maybe I'm not concerned with web or adult material, but I would recommend that you look at this. Again, if you've been on another Firebytes, you probably heard me talk about this, locking down the security channel. So as I mentioned before, I had, for instance, CryptoLocker downloaded in my environment to look at the effects of it on my machine. Because I had security blocked, and more specifically this advanced malware command and control, it did not allow the ransomware to grab those encryption keys and encrypt my file. So whether or not you're concerned with all this other categories, make sure that you have a security checked under your web blocker categories. It's going to be a perfect way to again, that layered defense against unfortunately, the ransomware that's running out there. So again, we have bank managers, from bank managers to any external, and we can go ahead and click OK on that, which I can't get to my OK button. I'm just going to go ahead and cancel that. Now, in the case where I had said the 4100 outbound, we have the pre-built policy for that. So we're talking about WatchGuard Authentication. Now, if you're familiar with this, and again, anything that you can do through Policy Manager, you can do with a web GUI. But from here, we have WatchGuard Authentication, port 4100. Now we could say, you know what, we want to be able to manage a firewall externally. So rather than having just any trusted, any optional, obviously if you're internal to the firewall, you're going to be able to manage it. But now you can just add in that group of, so we're going to add other, we're going to choose bank managers. I know a number of you are saying, oh gosh, hopefully bank managers are managing my firewall. This is just an example of how to add a group into the WatchGuard Authentication, and then they can just hit port 4100 externally, authenticate as, let's say, Johnny, that's a member of bank managers, and then they have access to your firewall. So the other case, obviously, is that we're just building a policy now for, we have the bank managers. Now we can just add in another policy and then simply hit the duplicate this button for clone. We can do that for application control. As I mentioned, you're taking your most restrictive set, creating a clone, and then you're loosening it up, and certainly you can do that through the clone method as well. So the next step is, as I mentioned, tying into a VPN. So if we just go into VPN, most of you are aware WatchGuard does IPsec through any IPsec client you have. We have a download for the TrueSoft client. What I would recommend, simply because I'm on the road quite a bit traveling, and a lot of networks don't play well with IPsec, I use almost solely this SSL client. Activate mobile VPN with SSL. Now, depending on your environment, you might talk about routing all VPN traffic through there. You can force all traffic through the tunnel. Now, in my case, I love doing this because if I'm in a coffee shop and joining their Wi-Fi, I don't want people snooping on my traffic. So simply by forcing all client traffic through the tunnel, I spin up that VPN session on my iPad or my iPhone, or Android for that matter. It's going out securely. No one's able to listen to it. And if I go to what is my IP, it's going to be my office IP address because I'm forcing all client traffic through that tunnel. Now, I've had a lot of questions recently on how we can lock down, for instance, let's say Johnny needs to have access to 1 or 2 inside resources. You could specify those allowed resources here, or what you can do is build policy based on Johnny, and then that's going to apply whether or not he's coming in on a VPN or through external as well. We can come under authentication server settings here. Now, as I mentioned, one of the powers of WatchGuard being able to specify multiple domain names, you can have multiple domains as well through SSL VPN. Now, what you can do is tie in different defaults. So as you see here, we can click on, for instance, Firebox database. We can make WatchGuard -lab the default. That really comes into play when they hit the authentication portal on there. And then we can tell it the groups as well on here. So if we wanted to tie in the groups, we can tie that group in as well. Let me grab it, the group that I have here. I'm going to tie that in. And now anyone in this group is going to be able to authenticate against my firewall. Now, just so everyone's clear, as I keep mentioning the port 4100, I'm going to show you what that is. So if you did have an outside IP address or domain, you could tie that in here. You can then go to port 4100. I don't have my certificate signed simply because it is a test environment. But in this case, as I mentioned, the power of being able to make it the default is going to select that WatchGuard -lab as the default. I'm going to type in my username and password, and it's going to authenticate here. Now, some of the tips and tricks that I've was mentioning I would show you is to look and be able to test that Active Directory integration. Now, as we look at a firewall, again, this is running 11.10.1, the newest code. I think this is going to be released fairly soon here, but looking at, for instance, the system status, we can look at the authentication list so we can see the users authenticated into my firewall. I can go ahead and log them off if I wanted to do that. I can also do that through the WatchGuard. Let me just show you through the Firebox System Manager. Many of you are still using the Windows side of things. It's great. We have the authentication list here, which we see the same users. We can log them off here as well. So anything that you can do, pretty much anything on the firewall, on the policy manager side, you could do through the web. Now, one of the tips and tricks about the web that I love is being able to come under your server connection and be able to test out the connection to your LDAP server. So in the instance that you can't get that link to work, maybe you're in an environment where your domain controllers locked down through the internal firewall. This allows you to be able to test out users and groups, test the connection. We see the login, see OK, it's the user's authenticated, and now we can actually get the group membership. So in the instance that we wanted to find out why a group wasn't applying successfully on the firewall, maybe it's that the administrator user wasn't part of a specific group, and we can go ahead and create that group as well here. But again, this is going to just be that integration component, tying your firewall into Active Directory. And then next time, as we look at the power of being able to leverage, taking that one step further so that we can seamlessly identify users based on that single sign-on component, so that we have that, rather than users having to hit port 4100 internally, we can now seamlessly identify those. We can also, as I mentioned, one of the last things we'll cover today is how to manage your internal users and roles group from here. So let's just go ahead and take a look at that as well. We can now specify users, users and roles in the internal firewall. We can also tie directly into your authentication server. And we can give maybe your network engineers different roles in your environment. So we could say they're simply a device monitor, or maybe it's a device administrator, guest administrator. So we can tie directly into a specific user through Active Directory this way. So again, just a great way to be able to integrate Active Directory so that we have, if users are changing their passwords on the Active Directory, now they can log in with a changed password on the WatchGuard firewalls. So with that, I want to bring this session to a close. Again, my apologies for having that screen resolution too small for you. I did resolve that. Hopefully you're able to follow along. We will post that shortly on the WatchGuard channel. And if you haven't checked this out, feel free to subscribe. It's just youtube.com/WatchGuardNW for Northwest. Those videos are posted there. Or you can reach out to me, or if you're from a different region, your respective sales engineer. But again, if you have any topics, any suggestions, or topics for future Firebyte sessions, let us know. I'm glad to work that into the schedule, and Wendy will send out the messaging for that so that you can get signed on. But my apologies for running slightly over today. We just want to make sure that we're maximizing your time, allowing you to grab some quick tidbits of information, learn how to leverage your WatchGuard infrastructure even further. So just as a recap, next Firebyte, Friday, July 24th, it's going to be over integrating single sign-on from there. So with that being said, Want to wish you a great Friday. Have a great weekend. And until next time, we'll see you on integrating single sign-on with WatchGuard. I'm Johan Blumhardt, Sales Engineer for WatchGuard. See you next time.